Blue lights explode across the rearview mirror at almost midnight. The road is empty, except for one patrol car, glued to the bumper, drifting closer than normal, almost impatient. Your stomach tightens before you even touch the brakes, because something already feels off. You know you are not speeding, you know your tags are current, you know your headlights are on, but the lights stay flashing anyway. Then comes the moment every driver recognizes instantly. You pull over. The officer walks up slowly, flashlight cutting through the cabin, scanning your hands, your face, the floorboards, the back seat, every movement. Before you even speak, the questions start. Where are you coming from tonight? Why'd you take so long to stop? Have you been drinking? And suddenly you realize this may not be a normal traffic stop at all. Have you ever been pulled over by police and felt like the officer was fishing for a reason to justify the stop after the fact? Tell me what happened in the comments, because a lot of drivers experience things during traffic stops that they do not fully understand until much later. And there is one mistake people make during these encounters that quietly changes the entire outcome before they even realize it. A lot of people grow up believing traffic stops are simple. Police pull you over for a violation, they explain the reason, you hand over your documents, maybe you get a ticket, maybe you do not, and everybody leaves. That is the fantasy version most people carry around in their head. Real roadside encounters are messier than that. Sometimes officers absolutely have a valid reason for stopping a vehicle. Sometimes they prevent dangerous situations. Sometimes they save lives. But there are also situations where officers initiate stops based on weak assumptions, vague suspicions, profile-based observations, boredom during late-night patrols, pressure to produce arrests, or simple curiosity. And when that happens, the stop can spiral fast, because the officer suddenly needs the encounter to produce something that justifies the original decision. That is where things go horribly wrong. A lawful traffic stop in the United States generally requires reasonable suspicion that a traffic violation occurred or that criminal activity may be happening. That standard matters more than most people realize, because the entire stop grows out of that first moment. If the foundation is weak, officers often start probing aggressively to strengthen it after the stop has already begun, and drivers rarely recognize this in real time. What usually happens is psychological pressure takes over immediately. The lights activate, adrenaline spikes, the driver starts second-guessing themselves. Did I drift over the line? Did I miss a signal? Maybe I was speeding without realizing it. Most people begin mentally searching for a reason before the officer even reaches the window. That uncertainty gives officers room to control the encounter. Now here is something many drivers never think about. Officers are trained to observe behavior before they even make contact. They watch how long it takes you to pull over. They watch whether your hands disappear below the window line. They watch whether passengers turn around repeatedly. They watch if someone leans toward the center console. They watch body language constantly. But there is another side to this that nobody talks about enough. Drivers also observe officers, and sometimes drivers notice signs that the officer himself is uncertain. Maybe the officer walks up and immediately starts asking broad fishing questions instead of stating the violation. Maybe the alleged reason for the stop changes midway through the encounter. Maybe the officer sounds oddly vague. You were kind of weaving a little back there. Your speed was inconsistent. You braked suddenly when you saw me. That kind of language matters. Experienced defense attorneys pay attention to wording because uncertain language sometimes reveals uncertain justification. Officers know they cannot legally stop vehicles just because somebody looked suspicious in a general sense. So they often rely on tiny traffic infractions as gateways into larger investigations. A license plate frame covering part of the state name, a lane touch, tint, a wide turn, failure to signal for the full required distance. Most drivers have no idea how minor some stops begin. And once the stop starts, officers often try to extend it beyond the original purpose. This is where many people accidentally trap themselves. An officer asks, "Mind if I ask where you're headed?" That sounds harmless, casual, friendly even. But people do not understand that roadside conversations are investigative tools. Officers compare answers against behavior, timelines, passenger statements, visible items in the vehicle, nervousness levels, and inconsistencies. One passenger says they are heading home. The driver says they are coming from dinner. Now the officer senses an opening. Suddenly the stop changes tone. What restaurant? What time did you leave? Who were you meeting? What's in the backpack? And now everybody inside the vehicle feels pressure building. What makes these situations dangerous is that innocent people often become more nervous than guilty people. That surprises many viewers, but it is true. A person hiding contraband may mentally prepare for police interaction every day. Meanwhile, a completely innocent driver who has never dealt with police before may panic visibly during basic questioning. Officers know this. That is why nervousness alone is not enough legally to justify searches or prolonged detention in most situations, although officers still frequently mention it in reports. He appeared unusually nervous. His hands trembled. She avoided eye contact. You know what is fascinating? Almost everybody gets nervous during traffic stops, especially when multiple officers arrive, flashlights flood the vehicle, radios crackle loudly, and questioning becomes repetitive. And officers repeat questions intentionally. That is another thing many people misunderstand. If an officer asks where you are going 3 different ways, they are not necessarily confused. They are testing consistency. They want to see whether details shift under pressure. Where are you headed tonight? So you're going home? How far is home from here? That repetition creates psychological fatigue. People begin over-explaining. They start adding unnecessary details. They feel silence because silence feels uncomfortable. But silence is not illegal. A huge number of drivers sabotage themselves simply because they cannot tolerate awkward pauses. An officer walks back from the patrol car. So what's really going on tonight? Long silence. Most people panic during that silence and start talking. That is exactly what officers expect. Now let's talk about one of the biggest myths surrounding traffic stops, because this misunderstanding causes endless problems on American roads. A lot of people believe they can out-argue police during the stop itself. Terrible idea. If an officer claims you committed a violation, the roadside is not the courtroom. Even when the officer is wrong, aggressive roadside debating usually escalates tension instead of helping. Officers interpret argumentative behavior as resistance, non-compliance, or potential threat indicators. That does not mean surrender your rights. It means understand timing. There is a difference between calmly refusing consent and emotionally challenging authority in a way that escalates the encounter. That distinction matters enormously. Imagine this scenario. An officer says, "Mind if I take a quick look inside the vehicle?" The driver immediately explodes. "You cops always violate people's rights." Now the emotional temperature rises instantly. Backup may arrive. The officer becomes more suspicious. Everything slows down. Compare that with a calm response. "I do not consent to searches, officer." Short, controlled, non-hostile. That difference changes encounters more than people realize. Because officers are constantly assessing risk and control. Tone matters. Body language matters. Hand movements matter. Even eye contact matters. People think police interactions are purely legal exchanges, but they are heavily psychological. Officers are evaluating whether the situation feels stable or unstable every second. And here is something uncomfortable but true. Officers sometimes push boundaries specifically to see whether drivers know their rights. That happens more than many people want to admit. A driver may politely state they wish to remain silent, yet the questioning continues anyway. Why don't you want to answer? If you have nothing to hide, why not cooperate? You're making this harder than it needs to be. Those statements create social pressure. Officers understand most people crave approval and fear appearing guilty. Silence feels socially unnatural, especially under authority pressure. So drivers start talking again. Then the officer finds inconsistencies. Then suspicion grows. Then the stop expands. What began as a minor encounter suddenly becomes a roadside investigation lasting 40 minutes. Now here is where illegal or questionable stops can become truly dangerous for officers themselves. Some officers become so focused on gaining compliance that they forget citizens are recording everything now. Dashcams, cell phones, passenger recordings, nearby surveillance cameras, body cams. Modern traffic stops generate evidence from multiple angles, and officers who become careless, dishonest, or overly aggressive sometimes create legal disasters for themselves and their departments. There have been situations where officers claimed they smelled marijuana before searches, only for bodycam footage to contradict their timeline completely. There have been stops where alleged lane violations never happened on video. There have been officers caught extending stops far beyond legal limits, while waiting for canine units without sufficient reasonable suspicion, and juries notice these things. But drivers also make catastrophic mistakes during these encounters, especially when they become emotional. One of the worst things innocent drivers do is physically resist commands because they believe the stop itself is unlawful. This is dangerous territory. Even if the stop later turns out illegal, roadside physical resistance can rapidly escalate into force, arrest, additional charges, or worse. Courts generally expect people to challenge unlawful stops afterward through legal channels, rather than physically resisting in the moment. That reality frustrates many people, but understanding it can keep situations from turning deadly. Now let's talk about passengers, because passengers often misunderstand their role during traffic stops. Passengers sometimes think they are invisible during the encounter. They are not. Officers watch passengers intensely because passengers often reveal more than drivers. Nervous movements, whispered conversations, sudden silence, reaching under seats, exaggerated friendliness, hostility, fake sleep, all of it gets noticed. And officers frequently separate passengers psychologically by asking inconsistent questions individually. Where are you all coming from? The driver answers one thing. The passenger hesitates half a second too long. Now the officer senses tension. People underestimate how much hesitation matters during roadside interactions. Even small pauses can trigger suspicion because officers spend years reading behavioral cues under stress conditions. But here is another reality that deserves attention. Officers can also misinterpret innocent behavior constantly. A tired driver may appear impaired. An anxious passenger may seem deceptive. A medical condition may resemble intoxication. Speech delays, shaking hands, avoiding eye contact, confusion under stress, all of these can be innocent and still draw scrutiny. That is why illegal or weak stops become so problematic. Once an officer starts from suspicion instead of evidence, every normal human behavior can start looking suspicious through that lens. And the longer the stop lasts, the worse this effect becomes. Fatigue builds, pressure builds, people say things poorly, contradictions appear, tiny mistakes suddenly matter. I have seen situations where officers held documents for extremely long periods while continuing unrelated questioning. Drivers often do not realize something important there. When an officer keeps your license and registration while asking investigative questions unrelated to the traffic violation, the encounter may still legally feel non-consensual because most people do not believe they are free to leave without their documents. That matters in court. Timing matters, sequence matters. What officers say before and after returning documents matters. And this is where bodycam footage becomes critical. Sometimes officers casually phrase commands as requests. You don't mind stepping out for me real quick? Technically phrased like a request, realistically perceived as a command by nearly every civilian on earth. Drivers rarely feel free to refuse anything during police encounters, even when legally allowed to do so. That gap between legal theory and real-world pressure is enormous. Now let's get into one of the most misunderstood parts of traffic stops. Officers asking drivers to step out of the vehicle. A lot of people automatically assume this means arrest is coming. Not necessarily. Courts have generally allowed officers broad authority to order drivers out during lawful traffic stops for officer safety reasons. But context matters heavily. How quickly the command happens matters. Whether backup suddenly arrives matters. Whether officers begin positioning themselves differently matters. Whether they separate occupants matters. Experienced drivers often notice tone shifts before anything explicit occurs. An officer who was conversational suddenly becomes formal. Hands move closer to the duty belt. Questions stop temporarily. Radio traffic increases. These subtle shifts often indicate officers are transitioning from routine stop procedures into investigation or enforcement mode. And many drivers miss those signals completely because they are trapped inside their own anxiety. Here is another thing people rarely discuss openly. Officers are human beings, affected by ego, fatigue, stress, fear, and frustration, just like everyone else. Most officers do difficult work under unpredictable conditions. But that also means emotions can influence encounters. An officer embarrassed during an earlier call may arrive irritated. An officer nearing the end of a 12-hour shift may become impatient faster. An officer who believes a driver is disrespectful may unconsciously scrutinize that driver more aggressively. None of this is supposed to affect legal judgment, but real life is not a textbook. Human emotions exist on both sides of the window. That is why calm behavior becomes strategically important, even when officers behave poorly. People think calmness is weakness. Actually, calmness is control. Drivers who stay measured force officers to own their own behavior on camera. Drivers who scream, curse, interrupt, or make sudden movements often unintentionally shift attention away from the officer's conduct and onto themselves. And this leads into something extremely important. Many illegal stop situations go horribly wrong, not because of the initial stop itself, but because of escalation afterward. A driver gets angry, the officer gets defensive, commands become sharper, voices rise, somebody moves suddenly. Now both sides perceive threat. Adrenaline takes over. Decision-making deteriorates fast under adrenaline. Fine motor skills decline. Auditory exclusion can happen. People literally stop processing information clearly. That is why even simple commands become confusing during tense encounters. Put your hands up, step out, turn around. People freeze, hesitate, misunderstand, argue, reach instinctively. Officers then interpret hesitation as resistance, and situations explode in seconds. One detail that deserves more public attention is how often officers use conversational tactics to gain consent or admissions indirectly. Instead of directly accusing someone, an officer may soften the language. You don't seem like a bad guy. Help me understand what's going on. Be honest with me and this can go easier. These phrases are psychologically powerful because they frame cooperation as relief. People desperately want the tension to end, so they start talking to reduce discomfort. Then they accidentally admit things. Maybe they mention drinking a couple beers. Maybe they acknowledge having a firearm in the vehicle without understanding local notification laws. Maybe they explain they were texting earlier. Now the officer has additional grounds for investigation. And once information enters the conversation, it becomes hard to take back. This is why pauses during traffic stops feel so uncomfortable. Silence leaves room for uncertainty. Officers know that many people would rather speak than sit quietly under pressure. But sometimes, silence protects drivers from making emotional mistakes. Now let's address another dangerous myth floating around online. Some people believe recording police automatically escalates encounters. That depends heavily on behavior and local law. But in many places, citizens legally record public police interactions as long as they do not physically interfere. The problem is not usually recording itself. The problem is performance behavior. Drivers who turn encounters into theatrical roadside arguments often make officers more defensive, while simultaneously making themselves less focused on safety and legal strategy. Quiet recording is very different from aggressive confrontation, and officers know cameras cut both ways. A professional officer often behaves more carefully when recorded. An unprofessional officer may become irritated. Either way, recordings frequently reveal details memory misses later, including tone, timing, commands, interruptions, and contradictions. Now here comes the part many drivers truly fail to appreciate until it is too late. Tiny decisions during the first 30 seconds of a stop shape almost everything afterward. Where you stop matters. How quickly you stop matters. Whether your interior lights come on at night matters. Whether your hands remain visible matters. Whether you begin digging around suddenly matters. Officers approaching unknown vehicles experience uncertainty every single stop. They do not know whether they are approaching a tired parent, an impaired driver, a wanted felon, or somebody armed and panicking. So officers interpret movements through a safety lens first. A driver reaching under the seat for registration may look innocent to the driver and dangerous to the officer. That mismatch creates tension instantly. This is why clear communication helps. My registration is in the glove box. My wallet is in my back pocket. Simple statements reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers of escalation during police encounters. Now let's talk about the phrase people hear constantly during stops. You're not under arrest. A lot of drivers relax immediately after hearing that. Sometimes they should not. You can be detained without being under arrest. That distinction matters legally and practically. During investigative detentions, officers may continue questioning, request backup, run checks, or pursue additional observations while claiming the stop remains active. Drivers often misunderstand their own status during these moments because officers use conversational language while maintaining legal control of the encounter. And then comes one of the most psychologically difficult moments in any questionable stop: the prolonged wait. The officer walks back to the patrol car. Minutes pass, then more minutes. Traffic rushes by. You stare into mirrors wondering what is happening. Your imagination starts racing. Are they running warrants? Calling a dog? Writing a ticket? Looking through databases? Talking about me? That uncertainty breaks people mentally faster than open confrontation sometimes does. By the time the officer returns, many drivers are emotionally exhausted and far more likely to consent to things they would normally refuse just to end the encounter. That is not accidental. Pressure changes decision-making. Now imagine this scenario because variations of it happen constantly. The officer returns. Mind if we search the vehicle real quick and get you on your way? Notice the phrasing, real quick. Get you on your way. The search gets framed as the fastest exit route. Many innocent drivers consent because they believe innocence guarantees safety. That assumption has destroyed countless people legally. Not because they committed crimes necessarily, but because searches uncover forgotten items, misunderstood objects, prescription issues, old paraphernalia, prohibited items belonging to passengers, or suspicious-looking clutter that suddenly becomes the center of an investigation. People forget how messy real vehicles are, and once officers start searching, control disappears from the driver almost completely. Now here is where illegal or poorly justified stops sometimes collapse entirely. Officers occasionally become overconfident and start stacking weak justifications on top of each other. A vague lane violation becomes nervousness. Nervousness becomes inconsistent travel plans. Inconsistent travel plans become prolonged detention while fishing for probable cause. But modern video evidence has exposed many of these patterns. Courts increasingly analyze whether officers unnecessarily prolonged stops beyond the original traffic mission. The legal question often becomes whether the officer diligently handled the traffic matter or intentionally delayed things to investigate unrelated suspicions. And yes, timing can decide entire cases. Seconds matter, order matters, words matter. That is why experienced attorneys obsess over bodycam timestamps. Now let's talk about one of the saddest realities in roadside encounters. People often talk themselves into arrests they could have avoided entirely. Not because they are hardened criminals, because they are scared. Fear makes people over-explain. A driver caught with alcohol on their breath might panic and lie repeatedly, instead of calmly remaining quiet and requesting counsel later. A passenger with an old warrant may begin acting erratically. A driver transporting legally owned cash may suddenly sound evasive because they fear asset seizure myths they saw online. Officers notice emotional shifts immediately, and emotional instability tends to increase investigative attention. But there is another side to this too. Some officers rely too heavily on instinct instead of evidence. They trust gut feelings developed through years of patrol experience. Sometimes those instincts help identify danger. Sometimes those instincts wrongly target innocent people. That tension sits at the heart of countless controversial stops in America. How much suspicion is reasonable before government authority intrudes into ordinary life? That question never fully disappears, and ordinary drivers live inside that uncertainty every day without realizing it. Maybe that is why traffic stops feel uniquely stressful compared to most other public interactions. There is an imbalance of authority, information, and control from the beginning. The officer knows more about procedure. The officer controls the stop duration. The officer carries legal authority and force capability. Meanwhile, the average civilian often has incomplete knowledge mixed with internet myths, fear, pride, and adrenaline. That combination creates unpredictable outcomes. Sometimes the stop ends with a warning and everybody forgets it by morning. Sometimes one sarcastic comment changes the officer's tone entirely. Sometimes a driver refuses consent calmly and the officer leaves frustrated but professional. Sometimes an officer pushes too far and bodycam footage later destroys the department's credibility. Sometimes innocent people get arrested anyway and spend months untangling the consequences. And sometimes the most dangerous part of the encounter is not obvious aggression at all, it is confusion. Confusion about rights, confusion about obligations, confusion about whether questions are optional, confusion about whether someone is free to leave, confusion about what officers legally can and cannot do. That confusion causes hesitation, and hesitation under pressure creates mistakes. The drivers who navigate these encounters best are usually not the loudest people or the most confrontational people. They are the people who stay emotionally controlled while understanding the environment they are standing in. They know officers observe behavior constantly. They know every unnecessary word can expand the interaction. They know roadside arguments rarely produce victories. They know consent once given is hard to undo. They know calmness is not surrender. And they know something many drivers learn only after a terrible night on the side of the road. An illegal stop does not always begin with screaming, force, or obvious misconduct. Sometimes it begins quietly, with uncertainty, fishing questions, prolonged pauses, changing explanations, and the driver too nervous to realize the encounter already drifted far beyond what should have happened. Then the lights finally turn off. The patrol car pulls away, and the driver sits there gripping the steering wheel in silence, replaying every question, every hesitation, every answer, wondering whether the stop was ever really about the traffic violation in the first place.